What we're going to do for that is learn about another missionary today. And last time we did this, we learned about John Paton. Today we're going to learn about a missionary that is another one very dear to my heart, a missionary named Amy Carmichael. You may have heard of Amy Carmichael. She is a gem of a lady, and I will be thanking her in heaven for the impact that she has made in my life. And she died in 1951. But she has a lasting legacy that we're going to review today. So if you would, if you have your Bible, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We're going to have a couple verses, a few verses, just set up the storyline that we're going to take in Amy's life. First Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12. Now if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. Lead us in with these few verses because they were very meaningful to Amy Carmichael's life. As she, in desiring to live a life to glorify God and want to be His completely, she actually heard a voice say that to her. And she ran home and knew it was from the Bible and went and found it. And when she found it in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, it set for her at 19 years old, it set for her a trajectory that the rest of her life, the rest of her days, she would want to be building with gold, silver, and precious stones. I think it's helpful for us to analyze how we're living life. How are we going about building? And what are the moments of our lives that we're really, or how in the moments of our lives are we building? Is it something with wood, hay, and straw that when fire is set to it, it's gone? Or is it something deeper and lasting that when the fire comes, it'll actually refine the work rather than burn it up? So let's journey into the life of Amy Carmichael. Amy was born in December of 1867 in Belfast, Ireland. She actually was from a wealthy family. Her father owned 2 mills during that time, and she was at boarding school. She always had a sense of adventure. When she was in boarding school, one of the science teachers said that in that September, there was going to be the September's comet passing that night. So Amy thought, we'd like to see that comet. She went and asked the headmaster. Headmaster said, no, absolutely not. You can't go see the comet because it's in the middle of the night and we need everybody to sleep because we have school the next day. Very regimented lifestyle in that school. She says, well, what if we don't leave the building? So she's thinking to herself, the girls are really saying they always looked to her as a leader. How are we going to see the comet? We need to see the comet. So she says, okay, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to tie a string to each one of your toes in the dorm, and all of our toes are going to be connected to that string, and I'm going to pull it every once in a while to keep us awake. And when I pull twice, we're all going to get up, and we're going to go very quietly, and we're going to skip the 3rd step because it squeaks, and we're going to go up to the attic where there's a skylight, and then we'll be able to see the comet. Everybody's very excited about that, so they all go to bed at the appointed time, and she's pulling every once in a while, and everybody's toes, everybody's excited, staying awake. Pulls twice, it got to that time. She goes upstairs, and as everybody's skipping the 3rd step, it's going swimmingly, and she gets up to the attic, and she sees this figure in the corner, and it was the headmaster waiting for them. She didn't make him go down. She let him watch the comet, but then went down, told Amy to report to her office the next morning. She reported to the office, and she had some extra chores to do. So the headmaster was actually kinder than Amy had anticipated. She grew up in a loving family with a mom and dad who loved Jesus. And her mother, most importantly, passed on a faith to her, a faith that showed up in her prayers. And she told Amy that God would answer all of her prayers. So Amy, as a little girl, said, I really want blue eyes like my mother. I don't want brown eyes. I want blue eyes. So one night she prayed, Lord, I pray when I wake up tomorrow morning, I will have blue eyes. She went to bed real fast because she knew God was going to answer her prayer. And the next morning she woke up, she looked at her reflection, and she still had brown eyes and very sullen, went downstairs, sulking. Her mother said, what's wrong, Amy? Well, you said God would answer all the prayers that I prayed. And last night I prayed that I would have blue eyes, not brown eyes, because I want to be like you, and I don't have blue eyes today. And Amy's mom very wisely said, sometimes God answers with a no. Something that she would have to hold on to. But she grew up with this sense of adventure, but also with an understanding that Jesus and God's purpose on her life needed to be the thing that she was living for and praying for. There was a turning point that happened when she was 17. Her father got very ill and ended up dying, and they couldn't afford boarding school anymore, so she came home. One day, walking home with her brothers from church, they were walking ahead. As everybody, it was cold, so they're trying to get home just because it's cold, but the kids are ready to leave church anyway. So they're ahead of her mother and her other siblings, and they're walking, and all of a sudden a beggar, a lady, came who just was very disheveled and very old and very just decrepit and limping along and trying. And Amy and her brothers saw that, and rather than pass her by, they helped her. And they asked her where she was going, and they couldn't figure it out. Finally, it was down the road, and so they were helping her go down this road. And as they're helping her down the road, rather than everybody else help, everybody else was staring and avoiding them, even going to the other side of the street to walk. These are the same people that came with them from church. So as they're walking, Amy felt embarrassed. At the one point, wanting to give up helping the lady because of everybody else's looks, and so she just said, no, we're going to do this. And trying to distract herself, she looked ahead up on the road, and there was a fountain in the middle of the road. And as she looked at that fountain, this is what she heard. Gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw. The fire will test what sort of work each has done. If the work which any man has built on that foundation survives, he will receive a reward. 1 Corinthians 3, 12-14. She went home. She knew she read that in her Bible, and she scoured and looked everywhere and finally found it. And after hours of prayer, she told the Lord and committed to him, I will serve you no matter what anybody else thinks. And I will serve you at whatever cost it is to me, even if it's the cost of embarrassment. I'm going to serve you. And it was a turning point in her life as well as her brothers. She began in Belfast to find girls that were just around, and they were maybe just walking around. Maybe they were from the poor side of town. She found these girls, and she wanted to meet with them because they were anxious about learning about the Bible, and she wanted to give them more information about the Bible. So they began meeting at the church on Sunday afternoons. And it began to grow to where they needed another meeting, so they started another meeting on Saturday mornings and called it the Morning Watch Club, because they were watching for Jesus, because they wanted to see him. During this time as she's ministering, she got to go with a gentleman to Glasgow, Scotland. And while she was there, a lady came from across the street, and a little girl came into the street, and Amy went to go pick up the little girl, and this other woman came and snatched the little girl from Amy before she could hold her. And Amy's thinking she's an older lady, but there was this covering over her face, and when it moved, she recognized she was a young lady, but she just had all kinds of soot and dirt and everything on her. She asked the gentleman she was with, who is this? He said, oh, those are called Shawleys. They work at the factories 6 or 7 days a week, and they work 12-hour shifts, and they're usually so poor that they can't afford a hat, so they take their shawls and put them over their heads. I think we have go back, Bub. Right there. Those are the Shawleys. And as they had these, that's how they were known. They just came to be known that, but they were in the poorer sections of town. They lived in the slums, and they worked at the factories and barely made any money to survive. When Amy got back to Belfast, she realized, oh, there's Shawleys here. I never saw them before. So she began a ministry to the Shawleys in Belfast. Then they started meeting at church. To the ire of the church said, we don't want these disgusting people meeting here. So Amy then said, all right, we need to pray for a building. And she saw an ad in the newspaper about these new iron buildings that were for a set cost, and you could buy them. And so she said, we need one of those. And as she's praying about that, trying to figure out, she was wondering if she needed to ask for money, didn't know what to do. But as the oldest girl in the society, the oldest girl in the family, she needed to go with her mother to return calls. All the ladies during that time, they would send a formal invitation to another family and say, oh, please come over for tea, let's talk, let's visit. Amy couldn't stand them because they were just a bunch of adult nonsense talking. And as she's sitting there, one of the ladies asked her, and several of the ladies realized they shouldn't ask Amy what she's been doing, because she would tell them all the work that she's done with the Shawleys, and they would feel embarrassed for her because they just didn't do that. The high society didn't associate with the low society. So one time, a lady said, well, how's it going, Amy? What have you been up to? And she began to tell her all about the Shawleys and the need for a building, and that she was trusting God for a building. And this woman, God turned and stirred the heart of this woman, that when Amy left, this woman wrote her a note, and with it was enough money to buy a building and property to put it on. She gave it all. And it came to be known as the Tin Tabernacle. That's the next one. These little huts, they got to the point where they were having 200 women jammed in these little places. And now that it was exclusive for the ministry to the Shawleys, they had programs all throughout the week. And Amy learned, she learned to wait for God to supply the right people for the position. And she waited, because people would just come wanting to do something nice for others. She said, no, that's not the people that we need. We need people who understand what God's doing and going after those hearts. And that's who we need to serve here. And she waited and waited, and God supplied. As she was ministering there, finances for her mother and sisters ran out. Her father tried to invest some things. When he was sick, he tried to invest some money that would take care of them. Those deals fell through, and she needed to move. Mrs. Carmichael was offered a job in England, right outside of London. And so she went there. And so as she is doing this job, Amy says, I still want to work with the Shawleys. So she moves to London and moves into the slums with the Shawleys. And as she's ministering there, one of them, and this came to be a hallmark, came to be something that she always did in her life. She wanted to relate with the people that God called her to minister to. And she did it in the areas that she went. Every place she went, she found ways to build a bridge into their lives. She's with the Shawleys, living in the slums, gets very sick. She would pray at night to not be startled by the rats that ran through her room. She'd pull her covers really tight and hope that roaches didn't go in her sheets. When she could have had the opportunity to live a little more comfortably with her mother, she says, no, this is where God called me. This is where I want to be. As she's waiting there, when she got real sick, they told her, and the best remedy for sickness during the late 1800s was to go out to the country and outside of the city and breathe cleaner air, and just months and sometimes years, you were finally getting well. She knew she needed to move, even though she didn't want to leave her work with the Shawleys in London. She moved to a family friend's house named Robert Wilson, who she then called the dear old man, the Dom. She called him Dom. And he became a father to her, not only physically in caring for her, but also a father in the faith, as he was very connected with what was known as the Keswick Society. The Keswick Society had they had conferences all over England during that time, and they brought in Hudson Taylor. And Hudson Taylor, who was a missionary in China, he started China Inland Mission. He came many times, and he would go travel. And as Amy got better, she was scheduling these conferences and traveling with Mr. Wilson to go do these. And as she's there, she felt the Lord say, "Go ye." In one of the conferences, she began to pray about it. What does that mean, Lord? She knew that was from the Bible too. She knew where the Great Commission was. So she got, what does that mean? Well, an opportunity opened for her to go to, she at first said, I'm going to go to China. She knows Hudson Taylor, who started it. He said, we can absolutely use you in China. When she went for the physical, the doctor said, I can't pass you because you're so sick. You're so frail because of your because you've been so weakened by living in the slums, I can't pass you. And going home very discouraged, he told Mr. Wilson that. Mr. Wilson said, we just need to trust that the Lord will open a door. And the Lord opened an opportunity for her to go to Japan. And she sailed all the way to a harrowing time. She was caught in a typhoon in the Pacific Ocean on her way to Japan. It was just, it was misery trying to get there. But she, while being there, was sharing the gospel. She was starting to learn the language, and she had a translator that would travel with her to share the gospel. And she's wearing her traditional English Victorian-style dress, where it's up here and all the way down to the floor. Can't even see the shoes. And she's looking at the Japanese women wearing the kimonos. And as she's sharing the gospel one day, this one lady is just staring at her dress. Not even listening to her, just staring at her dress. And Amy realized, you're distracted by my clothing. So Amy said, which was very unpopular in missionary societies, she started wearing a kimono, the traditional Japanese dress, in order to build a bridge for the gospel proclamation. And as she is sharing, one time they were known to use pictures of Jesus to share the gospel message. And once she was speaking with a girl one day, and the girl said, I'm going to go see Jesus tonight on the magic box, or the magic screen, because they had a video that they were showing, and it had Jesus on the screen. And she realized that in Buddhist thought, in Japan being primarily Buddhist in religion, Buddhism teaches that the God is in the image. It is in the idol itself. So then Amy said, we have to stop using pictures. And she very boldly said, no more using pictures. And she actually was able to be an influence on the other missionaries who had been there much longer than she had, to be an influence to them that they stopped using the pictures as well. So we see in her this desire to say everything we need to be about needs to be about Jesus. And if it's not something that if we can give it up, let's give it up in order to make way for Jesus. During her time in Japan, she actually struggled with whether to get married or not. She never had a thought about getting married, but she's seeing these other missionaries that she was staying with, and they were married and they had children, and she thought, maybe God wants that for me. And praying about that one night, she felt the Lord say to call her to be single, but also with the promise that she would never be alone. And she held on to that promise because it was her loneliness that was saying, God, should I be married? And God promised, you won't be lonely. Eventually, she became too sick even to continue in Japan. This was a huge discouragement to her because she was going to this one village and seeing huge fruitfulness. She had a faith that I just love this type of faith. She would ask the Lord, before she'd go into a village, she would ask the Lord, how many people do you want to save when we go into that village? And there was one particular village that she would frequent and went to, and she would ask that question, and God on one time said 3. And so they had a gathering of ladies, and she shared the gospel, and somebody prayed to receive Christ, but she knew we can't leave yet because there's 2 more. And then as they're walking along, somebody comes to meet them, said, I didn't have the opportunity to come to your gathering. I want to hear about Jesus. Ask that. I want to hear about Jesus. The second person prays to receive Christ right there. Then Amy knows, we can't leave yet. There's a third one. So a husband comes. He says, my wife has been asking about learning about Jesus, but she's out of town. She's out of the village right now and not due back for another couple days. And Amy thought, I'm like, God, you said 3, and my heart feels like that's the third one. What? So they waited. The middle of that night, the man came knocking on her door with his wife, who returned early unexpectedly. Shared the gospel, prayed with that woman to receive Christ. On another time, she went to the village, said, Lord, how many? He didn't give an answer. But she just served faithfully. So I love the fact that she was real about that too. Not every single time was this promise of lives and of harvest, but it was just obey me, Amy, just obey me to preach the gospel, and that became a mark of her life. In getting too sick, she was discouraged. She had what was called Japanese head. And the only cure for Japanese head was to get the head out of Japan. She had headaches, weakness, dizziness. They really didn't know what it was. They just said, you need to leave. And she ended up going down to present-day Sri Lanka to recuperate. And then eventually she went back to England. And she's living with Mr. Wilson again. And she's thinking, Lord, I heard go, but I'm back here. So what do I do? I'm back to the place that I felt like you called me from. So she just began to serve and began to pray. She was discouraged, but she was also very patient. Then she got a letter in the mail from a friend of hers from when she was younger, inviting her to go to India. And this friend had heard of Amy's sicknesses and her difficulty with climate. She couldn't take the cold climate of Japan. And so she said, come to India. It's in the southern portion. It's warmer climate. It's tropical. It'll be better. Amy looked at that and said, well, that's not much of India's under British control. It's not much of a sacrifice to go there because it's got all the luxuries of England there. But either way, she prayed about it and God said go. And in 1892, she arrived in India. She knew God had called her to India, but as soon as she gets there, she needs time to recover again because she got sick on the boat ride over. And feeling discouraged even by her sicknesses, she went and got stronger, and then she didn't think it was going to be, she thought she was going to help these missionaries, but they actually had to nurse her to health before she was able to have any type of fruitful ministry. And learning from what happened in Japan about the dress she didn't wear, the traditional Victorian-style English dresses, she chose a white cotton sari, which is the traditional Indian dresses that they have. As she's there, she just didn't like the way the English were there. The English were ruling over India, and in the caste system that India had, there's a caste system in Hinduism particularly, that if you are in a particular caste, you need to stay in that caste. You marry in that caste. You can't associate with anybody else who's not in your caste. You have to stay there because based in Hindu teachings, you have to be good enough in that caste. And when you're good enough, you can be reincarnated to the next caste. And then finally, you're a priest. And if you're good enough as a priest in the highest nobility caste, then you finally die and you're in nirvana. So it followed their system of belief. English were trying to undo that, but the English really didn't care about that as long as they were being served. So the Indian culture just became servants of the British culture. And it spilled over into the missionary efforts as well, and Amy just didn't like that. So when she started wearing traditional Indian dress, people didn't like her, and she finally said, I'm moving out. I'm not going to stay in the missionary compound. I'm moving out because God's calling me to something more. That was in 1897, just 5 years into her journey in India. Then she says, how do we minister to the ladies here? Not just in particular castes, but every lady that's there. And she began to ask the Lord for people who would go with her, particularly for converts in India, ladies that would be able to travel with her, and God answered her prayer. There were 3 ladies. One was just 16 years old at the time. The first one that came to her she heard Amy share the gospel. She wanted to believe it, but because of pressure from the family, she didn't commit her life to Christ. Because in the Hindu culture, when you committed your life to Christ, they would sometimes kill you. And if you were baptized, that was actually the worst thing. It was seen as a disgrace to the family name. and they either disowned you or they wanted to destroy your life and kill you. So this is the place that Amy's serving in, sharing the gospel. And this one lady, this one girl, 16 years old, comes to her. Figures out, she was actually in the care, she was a widow even at 16 because in Indian culture they were married by 11 or 12. And it was an arranged marriage. And she was a widow in the control of her father-in-law. But the father-in-law was sympathetic to Christianity. He was actually tricked into letting her go, which he was angry about afterwards and pulled a Pharaoh and said, wait a minute, I changed my mind, and then burned down the school and burned down a couple other things in the village to show his displeasure with Amy. Something that Amy took and said, we have to be careful in how we do this. And Panamel, her name, she was with Amy till the day that Panamel died. But the Lord added other ladies to her. And as other ladies came, they would go around and they would travel. They would travel at night they would travel during the day because at night they would be robbed. The Indian ladies in the culture, they wore jewelry everywhere. Bracelets up the arms, the piercings in the ears and nose, just necklaces, all that stuff. So they called themselves, actually, Amy didn't like the name, but she went with it, the Starry Cluster. Because it was just all this jewelry going on. But through Amy's disciple, Amy didn't wear any jewelry, but through her discipleship and example to these other ladies, they one by one started giving up their own jewelry. So then they could travel at night, travel anywhere, because they didn't have fear of being robbed. They didn't have fear of anything being stolen. The Starry Cluster ministered all around southern India. They would go out to villages and they would minister to the ladies and the girls in all of the villages. As she did that, she learned of a practice that Hindus, usually with poor Hindu families or disfigured females, Indian females, there was a practice that they would give their girls to the Hindu temples in a process called marrying their daughters to the gods. But really that was a sign that they would be abused for the rest of their lives. They would live in the temple and the Hindu priests would be over them and they would be abused by everybody that came through there, most importantly, mostly by the Hindu priests. When Amy saw this, and her eyes were open to it, she began to think about all the other girls who had been married to the gods and living in the temples. And she tried to figure out what to do and how to do it. And God actually brought the first girl to her, a girl named Prina. Prina, at 7 years old, when the ceremony was getting ready to happen to be married to the gods, she ran away from the temple. And she heard about this British lady who would take kids in. She didn't have any kids, but she just heard about this lady who was sympathetic to their cause. So as Prina escapes, they catch her, they bring her back, and they burn her hands as a punishment for escaping. But she still said, I don't want to be here. This is so cool. This is right out of Acts, when Peter was rescued from the jail. Prina, on the night before she was to be married to the gods, woke up. Remember, she's already escaped. Her hands are burned. She wakes up, didn't know who woke her up, looks around, her door is open, nobody's guarding the door. She walks out the door, nobody's guarding the gate outside the temple, and she hightails it right out of the temple and figures out where Amy is, and she shows up at Amy's house to live there for the rest of her life. And Amy took her in. I think Amy actually adopted Prina. Her name Prina means jewel of victory. Whenever a baby would come into their care, going with, remember, gold, silver, precious stones? Most of the time, Amy would name the baby after a stone. Just as a continual reminder of who that is. Amy became known, the one day that she realized why she had brown eyes is that periodically when she knew a girl in the temple wanted to be rescued, she would dress up as a high caste Indian woman. And the face was obscured by jewelry and things hanging across and stuff. She would go in and she'd have a big dress on, and she would go in there and she would take the girls in her dress and walk out. And she realized God had me have brown eyes because if I had blue eyes, they'd immediately know who I was. So she had brown eyes in order to save and rescue those girls, to where the neighboring villages called her the child-snatching Amma, the child-snatching mother. Amma is the Tamil word for mom. Then as more and more came, she said, we need a place to have them. And she found a village called Dohnavur. And as she had that, she trusted God. She went to that place and she said, God, you've got to provide a home for us. And you have to provide what we have. Where are we? There we are. You have to, good job, Owen. Way to keep up. You have to, I forgot all about the pictures. Lord, you have to have space for all of these people that you're bringing to us. You need space we need space. You need to provide that space. And God, one building after another, after another, after another. Even when boys started showing up, and then had boys' dormitories, and men who came to run the boys' dormitories, she, taking after Hudson Taylor's example, she never ever asked for money. She just believed God would supply what he wanted her to build. She had a desire to build a hospital, but it was through a series of circumstances she understood that God didn't want her to have the hospital first, because she got a big down payment, and it was specifically for a house of prayer. So she said, all right, the Lord must want us to build a house of prayer. And so this is the house of prayer. And there's the inside. It's a sprawling area. Dohnavur is still there. Dohnavur Fellowship is still there to this day, housing over 200 girls and boys. It's a school, and most of the construction was done by 1950, a year before Amy died and was taken to heaven. She did the house of prayer, then was able to build the hospital, to give now, because they didn't keep their casts in the fellowship at the home, and so they were able to serve one another. But it made it difficult for them to go outside and get a job. So Amy had the desire to have a hospital in order for them to have, they be trained in jobs while they were there. Babies came to them. Sometimes the babies did not live and they died, and God took them home. And Amy had a section of the land that she called God's garden. Anytime a baby would die, they would put the baby or person. Ponamel died of cancer years later, and they buried her in God's garden. Amy, she suffered a fall in 1931 and actually was bedbound. She was an invalid for 20 years. And she didn't like that because she felt useless doing that, but she was able to write, I think, around 25 books during that time. So she was always one to use her time very wisely. Amy, because she told them, I want to be buried here. I don't want to go back to Ireland. When she left England to go to India, she was in India for 55 years. Never went back home. Never went back home. And they buried her in God's garden. She didn't want any fanfare. Go one more. The one with the fountain. Can you find that one? The bird feeder. Or this. She didn't want a headstone. She didn't want anything. She made everybody promise, you're not going to do anything. You're not going to put me in a coffin. So they buried her straight in the ground. But they put a bird bath on her and just had the day that she died. And it's Amma right there. And every morning, to this day, every morning they go out and they fill that bird bath with water so birds can still use it. This is a huge legacy of a woman. What do we learn from her? We learn I think, three big things for us to learn. One, a takeaway, is obedience. This woman obeyed God. She knew God spoke to her, and she obeyed God. She always knew, she held on to Genesis 12:1, where God promised Abram to show him where he would go. She held on to that same promise. God, you'll show me. If I just obey, you'll show me where to go. But she was also, in her obedience, very patient with God's timing. She was very patient. We also learned sacrifice. She gave up what we look at. In the moments we think it's a lot, but she gave up what is worthless in order to gain the fruitfulness and the reward of building with gold and silver and precious stones. she gave up in order to bring the gospel to everyone she could. And her discipleship and the way that she understood discipleship, it demanded it. And you know what, church? That's the same discipleship that we celebrate. When God calls us to himself, he says, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Don't accumulate everything and have treasure on earth that's just going to be destroyed. But have treasure in heaven by giving up what's here. So we learn obedience from her life. We see sacrifice from her life, but ultimately we see her surrender. Just like Paul told the Philippians in chapter 2, verse 7, that Jesus made himself of no reputation, Amy made herself of no reputation. She wanted Jesus to be known. She wanted Jesus to be first. Now here's why I'm so... Owen, go back a couple to that arch thing. Right there. And this is the archway at the front of Dohnavur. It says in Tamil, the same phrase that she put up in the tin tabernacle. She put up a banner in the tin tabernacle and she carried it to Dohnavur and put it right here. You know what it is? That in all things, he might be preeminent. You know why we have the caption in our church? It's because in 2000 I read Amy's biography and I said, Lord, if you ever have me plant a church, I'd love for that to be our caption. So she has a lasting legacy for us. Because of when we learn from other believers, when we see their lives, when we have the cloud of witnesses that Hebrews 11 and 12 talk about, we have a cloud of witnesses before us. We have those that have gone before us that we've never met, will meet in eternity, and we have those that are around us today. Look, here's the challenge, church. Let's move from hoping to live that kind of life to living that kind of life. Because every moment of our lives is met with an eternal investment in that moment. Think about all of the moments. Think about the moments that you're with your children. Think about the moments you're with your spouse. The moments that you're at work. The moments you're in your neighborhood. The moment even laying your head down at night to go to bed. All of those moments have eternity connected to them. Are we living by faith in all of those moments? Are we living with an ear toward heaven saying, I'm listening. I want to be obedient. And I want to sacrifice. Lord, I want to be fully surrendered. I want you to be first. So the caption upon my life when people see me is Jesus. They don't walk away with something humorous or serious or confusing. They walk away with Jesus being the ambition of our lives. Look, in our go ye is just a willingness to be uncomfortable where we are. Don't get so settled and put our roots down to where, if God says go there, go here, it disrupts so much of our lives. No, because listen, God has placed us. We have, Acts 17, God places us exactly where he wants us for his purpose. So where our feet are is where our mission field is. Let's make sure that we are investing eternally in all of the moments of our lives, church. All of those moments. I'll finish with the quote that's on the last slide. I don't know if you can see it, but this is what it says. Give me the love that leads the way, the faith that nothing can dismay, the hope no disappointments tire, the passion that will burn like fire. Let me not sink to be a clod. Make me thy fuel, flame of God. May that be our prayer as well. Lord, thank you for the example of those that have gone before us. Thank you for the example of those around us. God, we ask that it would translate into our lives. It would translate into fruitfulness, that in every moment that we live, we are investing in eternity. Every moment is to be lived by faith upon a God who is invisible. Lord, we want to build with gold and silver and precious stones. Show us, give us discernment where it's wood, hay, and straw, that it'll just be burned up. Lord, we want to build something that has substance to it, that when you bring your fire to it, it will refine your purpose, not eliminate our works. May it refine your purpose, but have your way in our hearts. Bring us to total and absolute surrender. Thank you, Lord. Let's stand.